First of all, thanks so much, folks, for coming along to our witness seminar. And particularly thanks to our witnesses here at the front, who I'll introduce in a moment or two. This witness seminar is part of a programme of public engagement events that we're organising here in Scotland, in the northeast of England, and in South Wales, under the auspices of a Wellcome Trust-funded project, which many of you will know about, called The Cultural History of Coalfields. This is a 5-year collaborative project. It involves and is led by University of Swansea, by Anne Borsay and David Turner, and involves a team of 11 or 12 researchers, can't quite remember how many, investigating the history of disability in coalfield communities across the UK from the 18th century, from 1780 or so, through to nationalisation. 1947-48 is our end date. Angela Turner and myself, I'm Arthur McIvor, responsible for the Scottish end. We've got colleagues here, Vicky and Vicky, next to Angela, who are responsible for the northeast of England, though based here at GCAL. And we're all members of the Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare, which is a research collaboration between this university, Strathclyde, and GCAL. If I could just advertise our couple of sessions coming up. You might be interested in our public lecture, folks, which is on the 21st of May. I think you'll have that information in front of you. Public lecture here by Julie Anderson. Should be fabulous. And we've got a Disability History Roadshow going on at the National Mining Museum on the 14th of June. On the 14th of June, Ellie from the Mining Museum is here, and hopefully that will be a brilliant day of activities. And we'd welcome you all if you can make it. So that's the 14th of June. Disability is endemic in coalfield communities today, and indeed historically. Not least because of the enormous dangers which miners faced, and because of the scale of chronic occupational disease. Not only, but particularly relating to respiratory disease, pneumoconiosis, bronchitis, emphysema. Just a decade or so ago, for example, the Workmen's Compensation Industrial Injuries legislation, which after a 40-year struggle declared bronchitis and emphysema occupational diseases, just over a decade ago, this resulted in almost 500,000 industrial claims for compensation up and down the UK. In today's witness seminar, we'll hear from 4 eyewitnesses. Firstly, Nicky Wilson, well known to all of you, I'm sure, as the president of the NUM. Nicky started employment in 1967 in Cardowan Colliery and Steps, became an NUM official in 1972, and went full-time with the NUM from 2002. Secondly, Myret Bracken. Myret is the senior social worker for the Coal Industry Social Welfare Organisation. Has worked for CISWO since 2004. Thirdly, David McWhinney. David's a former miner who worked at the Lady Victoria Colliery from 1965 as a face worker. He finished up in 1989, and Davy has COPD and pneumoconiosis. And our 4th witness is Alex Bennett, an NUM rep on the medical appeal tribunals. Alex started work in 1962 in the Wilmot Colliery and worked as a face worker, finishing up in 1997, and along the way Alex was NUM secretary. The way it works, folks, is that each of our witnesses will say a few words, then we'll open it up for questions and answers and discussion. That's all I wanted to say by way of introduction, folks. We should get started. Nicky, I think, if you wouldn't mind, you're up first.
Just from here.
Please.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Albert. Can I just say, first of all, thanks very much to all you and your colleagues, north and south of the border, for this, because it is so important that things like this are recorded because of the effects it's had on people's lives. I mean, I started in 1967 when it was becoming a relatively technologically modern industry, but I worked with a lot of men who had drastically had their health affected in many ways, not only through chest diseases but through injuries over their time in the coal board. And I think we should always remember that many, many years before that, when miners were either disabled through injury or illness, it wasn't just their work that they affected, it affected their whole life, because they were put out of their house if they weren't able to work in the industry anymore because of tied houses. Their whole family suffered. It meant their children, probably, even if some of them had some academic skills, weren't allowed to take them on because they had to go at a young age into the collieries to work to become the breadwinners virtually in some cases. So I think it is crucial that we always understand the adverse effect that diseases have had and injuries and disabling miners, and, as I say, the effects of that. I mean, basically I would like to sort of give you a short brief of my experience, what it meant for a miner and my experience, as I say, who became disabled. Because one crucial thing that people probably didn't work in the mining industry tend not to know about is that in the coal board, you started at the bottom of the wage scale as you were a young lad coming into the collieries to work, and you sometimes ended up at the bottom of the wage scale as an older man as you became injured and disabled and were no longer able to carry out the higher paid jobs, because we were an industry that never had any wage protection whatsoever. And very, very quickly in mining, you understood how important it was, and probably a lot to do with the facts of why miners stick by each other so much, is that as you seen men through illness or disability being unfit to carry out their job, virtually everybody else carried them, because the last thing anybody wanted was a person to drop down the wage scale again. And I picked it up very, very quickly how important it was. Certainly for myself, I served my apprenticeship as an electrician, worked in the coal faces as an electrician, and although there's stories about electrician that my two colleagues could say that they wouldn't pick a stone off you if it fell on you, it wasn't true. And I used to appreciate the fact that if there were men who probably because of their age and their disabilities weren't fit, then as a younger person, when you'd time, you mucked in and helped them along. And that was what always impressed me about miners, and it was a very, very important key factor in protecting something we never achieved as a union, which was a wage protection scheme. And that came, just as a conscience thing. In my time in the union, I've got to say that I've been involved in a number of cases, and Arthur's mentioned some of them, about some of the diseases, even in recent times, that we've had to fight for. And sometimes there's this myth peddled by political parties of whatever persuasion that the miners got this and got that because we were good to them. Well, if you look at the history of it, the miners have never achieved anything bar they've had to fight through it, either through the court systems or by some other means. I mean, the 1974 pneumoconiosis scheme came about, an agreement between the National Coal Board and the unions because of the 1974 industrial action, when after a general election and a new party was came into power, that was one of the buy-offs, if you like, along with an improved pension scheme, was a pneumoconiosis agreement. But already, areas of the union were in court fighting through the courts to try and achieve that scheme anyway. Similarly with vibration white finger, with COPD, recently with osteoarthritis of the knee, we've had to take court action to win that. And unfortunately, thankfully in vibration white finger and COPD, we won that court action, and it meant compensation claims for hundreds of thousands of miners. I think there was 187,000 claims under vibration white finger and over 200 odd thousand claims for COPD. And unfortunately, the osteoarthritis of the knee one that recently Scotland area was involved in, along with Durham, South Wales area and Derbyshire, we fought that not as a national union, because unfortunately a national union didn't get involved in these cases, as in my opinion it should have done in the past, but it was left to areas to do it, and unfortunately we lost that. And when I say we lost it, we lost the compensation claims because they had judges' jurisdiction saying he ruled in a certain way. But as an offshoot of that, I think it's important to realise that IAC, the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council, who you probably know are the body, independent body that sits and looks at the evidence produced by parties to see if it becomes an acceptable industrial disease for a group of workers, not only miners, it could be steelmen, it could be shipyard workers or anything. But because of the court case for osteoarthritis of the knees that we unfortunately lost in a technicality, we won the right and IAC accepted it because of all the new evidence that was produced through the court case, and it's now an industrial disease. So when we lost in one hand, we gained in the other hand, and there's now thousands of miners throughout the UK have now got industrial injuries and a percentage disablement for osteoarthritis of the knee, which is a very crippling disease, as you probably know. So the unions, that's been a very, very important role in the union over many, many years, is to try and achieve these schemes. And unfortunately, there is an attitude at times from certain bodies that, you know, the miners, it's as if they're greedy. Well, they've got pneumoconiosis, they've got vibration white finger, now they want COPD, now they want osteoarthritis of the knees. But the argument is, if you work in an industry that disables you, then you've got it. You know, it's not about because you've got one, you shouldn't get another. And many men who worked in the industry have got all of these diseases. And it's right that they are compensated for what they gave in their time of work. I think the other thing about disability, and it isn't all about diseases at times, although that is crucial, because to be quite blunt about it, you know, we get a good scheme for vibration white finger. It paid quite a substantial amount of money to miners. But in the COPD one, you know, the difference is you don't die of vibration white finger. It can cause your life to be, you know, harder and things like that. But COPD and pneumoconiosis, diseases like that, are so debilitating, and the effects, if you ever see anybody, you know, that's suffered from it, you know, their quality of life is virtually nil. You know, when they're in oxygen, they can't walk 30 feet, you know, without hanging on to something. So you can never compensation for that, no matter what, as a union, we've ever achieved in compensation levels. You cannot buy back your health, and I think it's always important to remember that. We always do that. We strive to get something to make their life a bit easier if we can, but you cannot bring back their health, and that is a sad thing about some of the diseases we're involved in. One other thing I wanted to touch on, Arthur, if you don't mind, and I think it's crucial because, and probably Alec and Dave will know this as well, that when I started in the coal board in Cardown Colliery, there was about 1,800 men worked there at that time, and it was quite a substantial number of those men were disabled in their own way. And that was something that I think we can be proud that as an industry in the coal board we always had that when men get injured, and I'm talking about losing arms, losing legs, other injuries, losing eyes, things like that, there was always a way, or a big attempt, in most cases successfully, to try and create or give them a job somewhere else, not underground, not probably for the same amount of money, but to keep them employed. And that unfortunately disappeared, you know, as we moved into times changing into the 80s when things get harder and there was more of a tension between the employers and the unions and that. And a lot of those good things that had been there for many years actually disappeared. And I always thought that was good. And it wasn't just people disabled, but some people that had some mental health problems were also, you know, included and looked after by the workforce. I go back to what I said about miners underground not being fit. Well, these guys were always looked after as well. And I always thought that was important to have that. I mean, the other thing I think we should always remember, and it's before my time, but certainly speaking to, you know, older people that worked in the mining industries, the type of conditions they had to live in years ago. And, you know, you're talking about, well, other parts of the country had it as well. No outside toilet facilities, all the rest of it, cramped housing. And that led to other diseases like TB, like polio, like that, you know, that generally affected a lot of the population. But some of the conditions in the miners' rows and that for many years ago were horrendous for what I've heard. And, you know, you can understand why people having to cram themselves into small houses with the proximity of things that these diseases were rife. And again, that had the effect that some of these people would never have been able to take up employment because of that as they grew up. So, without going on too far, because I know you've got questions and hopefully we can delve into things about deeper, but as a union, we've always tried to play a role. It's about protecting. And I think one of the things we should look back in, as Arthur mentioned, the dust and the adverse effect that had through pneumoconiosis, silicosis, COPD, which it took us years and years to prove. Because the sad facts are that years ago, when you were fighting to try and get pneumoconiosis or silicosis, they would say it was chronic bronchitis emphysema on the death certificate or on the sick lines. And then when we proved that, then it was something else came up. And that, unfortunately, is the history of a lot of these things. But I think we've been right to fight that, and we've been right to prove it. And we have certainly won compensation for many, many people because of that. But as I say, it doesn't bring back their health, especially in the debilitating diseases like the chest disease. But the important thing about it is we learned many years ago about the importance of changing the working ways, because we virtually cut pneumoconiosis out of the mining industry, because for the 60s, 1960s onwards, started to look at dust in the coal mines. Dust suppression was introduced, you know, water sprays, machinery that didn't cause so much dust and all the rest of it. And gradually we worked our way through that. And the number of cases, certainly pneumoconiosis and silicosis, dropped very, very dramatically, getting into the 70s and 80s. And then, lo and behold, in the 1980s, we had it up here in Scotland at Longannet, the complex, pneumoconiosis reappeared. And it was not because of the working conditions that the dust was worth of that. But what happened then was that after the miners' strike in 84, 85, what happened was long-hour culture came in. That men, instead of working 7-hour shifts, 8-hour shifts, were working 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. That was how the nature of the industry changed after the strike. Basically because men were trying to earn as much money as they could to keep their family. And the work-life balance just disappeared completely for a period of time. And it's very, very difficult for a union to argue against that when it's understand what people think about their earnings, how they get the best for their family and all the rest of it. And sometimes, you know, it was difficult to stand up and say, well, we shouldn't be doing that. But, well, OK, so I'll lose £100 a week or £200 a week out of my pocket, but without thinking about the repercussions of that health-wise and family-wise. And thankfully, I think at the end up, when we had our last deep mine there, as a union again, we'd turned the tide and we'd negotiated a 4-day week and a 3-day week, you know, for the workers to try and give them a decent wage, but at the same time cut down the hours of work that were underground. And really that's why pneumoconiosis reappeared in the 80s, because of men working long hours, so they were exposed to the dust longer. Dust didn't get worse, it was there and it had improved. But if you're working 12 hours, 7 days a week in it, instead of 5 days a week for 7 or 8 hours, you can understand how effect that has. And I actually sat in the working party for the government that looked into the monitoring of the dust. And they changed that from a static monitoring unit that used to sit in an airway and pick up dust, which wasn't really an ideal system. And they now have individual monitoring, that people wear a monitor now for dust. And if your exposure goes over a certain amount, then you're not allowed to work excessive hours in a sense. So a lot of things have improved and we've got to continue to do that. But basically hopefully I've gave you some of my sort of thoughts on it and some of my experience, and I'm sure my colleagues will, fill you in some of the other things, and I look forward to the debate later. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nicky. Many thanks.